Viewers of this channel are probably aware how much of a fan I am of good boss fights. It encapsulates everything you have learned into one fantastic showdown, which is why it pains me to see how plain most 2D platformers treat such an opportunity. Luckily, the Kirby series is known for staging some of the best bosses in the series since the very beginning actually, and contrary to popular belief, not only with modern titles. So far, we ranked a couple of bosses from different games, but it's time to journey back to the very beginning and examine all of these memorable encounters from Kirby's Dreamland to this day. Technically, Poppy Bros is not a boss at the end of a level and therefore the foundation of what we understand as a mini-boss today. Because Dreamland only offers a couple of fights and no other mini-boss, it shouldn't be too detrimental to make an exception and include one additional fray to this ranking. As you have probably guessed, Poppy doesn't offer much of a challenge and functions basically like a tutorial for how the game wants to portray bosses. Unlike in traditional platformers, Kirby is not able to deal damage by jumping on the enemy's head, and due to missing copy abilities, the only way to deal damage is to inhale the opponent's projectiles and shoot them back. This dance between the foe's offensive and Kirby's passive countermeasures lets the game appear like a shmup put into a platforming context, which will be proved with a later boss on this list. Consequently, Poppy Bros serves his purpose of introducing this dynamic perfectly, but is logically simple and only throws a couple of bombs. Still, it's quite commendable to let him bounce and jump, as this might appear rather difficult for unexperienced players, who face this enemy only after mere seconds when the game starts. However, it's not something to seriously critique, and Poppy Bros can proudly claim to establish a tradition the series follows to this day. The true first boss of the game and probably most iconic enemy in the series. Wispy Woods is the stoic tree behind the expressionless face with only a few means to attack. Unlike Poppy Bros, Wispy's position is stationary, so there's no real danger coming from his body directly. To compensate for this seeming decrease of challenge, apples cover the whole arena and theoretically there's not a safe spot to hide. The reality, however, looks quite different, as the time span between each strike gives you more than enough moments to reposition. And if you try to trick the tree by sticking to his face, you might get hit by his blowing or pointy nose. All of this sounds way more challenging than it actually is, but I have to commend the thoughtfulness behind this simple encounter. That should prove itself to be the premise of many more wispy confrontations. Kabula is the only gimmick boss on this ranking and doesn't play out like other adversaries. By inhaling a special kind of power-up, Kirby gains the ability to float endlessly in the air with unlimited amount of breath to shoot. Kabula performs basically the very same kind of ability and tries to snipe Kirby from the air with all sorts of projectiles. It's a very one-sided battle without variation that lives through the hectic nature of maneuvering around obstacles while consistently positioning to the right place. While Dreamland resembles some kind of shooter mixed with a platformer on the ground, it's here where the emphasis becomes more than apparent. This influence is so strong, in fact, that even today's Kirby games inherit some kind of shmup sections whenever the opportunity calls for, and it's warming to see how much influence a 20-minute adventure like Dreamland still captivates on the series as a whole. Not to speak of the absolute brutal hard mode variation where it becomes nearly impossible to avoid any damage. I'm not over-exaggerating when I say that Kabula on hard mode is one of Kirby's most insane opponents in the franchise, and I would love to see the player who overcomes this challenge without taking any hits. Just like Wispy, Kracko made his debut in the very first title, and although he's not as present, he's still one of the most recognizable foes in the series. The same goes for his weaker variation Kracko Jr., which can be regarded as the foreplay to the actual clash. It's hard to describe this boss without sounding incredibly boring, since this is the foundation for every future Kracko battle in the franchise. He shoots thunderbolts, drops enemies for you to inhale, and dashes through the arena. Being the last regular boss in the game, it's enjoyable to see an adversary escalating so subtly in difficulty, since Kracko is not stationary and requires you to aim for the target and doesn't allow you to hide in a corner. It would have been more interesting to see him incorporate Kirby's floating ability a little more into the fight, since this is the enemy based on the sky, but having a first taste in form of Kreko Jr. is already an interesting take on this specific level. One thing to mention, and similar to Kabula, is the hard mode. Initially, Kreko might come across as unbelievable challenging, but there's actually quite the easy to learn pattern once you figure out how this boss behaves. Ironically, Kreko Jr. depicts the polar opposite, and despite the fact you can study his movement, it's still an incredibly brutal confrontation. Two bosses instead of one, as the twins act in harmony as the second main boss. Though it may seem strange to put such a simple boss so high on this ranking, there's something unique about this fight that tries to be very different from all the other bosses. Besides some minor layer switching, platforming is completely ditched in order to emphasize the inhaling and shooting aspect of Kirby's moveset. You have to carefully inhale the moving blocks while avoiding touching one of the twins' bodies, or keep an eye out on objects sneaking up from behind once they turn up again. When I complained about Kreko not making use of the floating skill, this is what I meant, and I'm glad the creators were so aware to focus a boss on this idea. Also similar to Kreko, there's a weaker variation before the actual fight, giving you one final chance to train your aim and take out the twins from another game. It shouldn't be surprising to see the most complex boss to be claiming the #1 spot on this list, just like he did with Dreamland. At the top of an intimidating mountain, the iconic theme starts to play, and the final showdown for stolen food is about to embark. Before that, Kirby has to face off every major encounter again, the perfect lead up to the climax and forerunner of any future boss arena. All of these standard bosses combine the fact that they function very simplistic in terms of gameplay. While some of them require different skill sets from you, they do not offer many variety in their actions, whereas DDD combines all of them into one singular opponent. This flexibility in options is proven by the fact that DDD presents multiple techniques, some of them quite tricky to dodge if you are unprepared. What's more are the limited moments to strike back. With Wispy, it's quite easy to catch the apples, the twins always carry an object to inhale, Kreko drops slow moving enemies, and Kabula is self-explanatory. DDD, however, leaves some starbits behind, which are quick to disappear if you're too slow. Today, this is the go-to strategy for every second boss in case the players know copy ability, but back then it was the perfect difficulty spike to make the final boss the most challenging one. The most surprising achievement, however, is the charm the creators managed to portray. There's only so much the little handheld can do, in fact not even proper colors, but they still accomplished the task of showing DDD's character without any cutscenes, voice lines or similar stuff, but his attacks instead. The clumsiness of tripping over his own foot or appearing extraordinary proud when performing a high jump are not necessary per se, as these skills will perfectly work without any specific animations. This kind of arrogance is even foreshadowed before the battle, with DDD's portrait being centered at the middle of the arena instead of using a mere door. Everything about this first final encounter is probably as perfect as it could be, and brings this short, sweet adventure to a more than fulfilling end. Although Dreamland offers an extremely brief adventure, it cherishes the limited hardware power presented by still creating some amazing fights for its time. Of course, nowadays it's nothing to gush about, but you have to only compare those enemies to the likes of similar Game Boy titles, and the contrast becomes more than apparent. However, this is only the beginning of many iconic foes, and hopefully you will look forward to even more boss rankings.